Well, it's really exciting to be here because I've learned much more and I really would like to rewrite my talk, except I submitted my slides a week ago. But I think as I'm talking, you're going to get to see why this research reinforces the real importance of doing prevention as well as intervention. So, the work I'm going to talk about today was based in a longitudinal study that we started in order to understand processes by which children with a sexual abuse history were at risk for developing problems, as well as who is going to recover more. And at the time we started the work, we knew that, yeah, this history was a risk, but there are a lot of children who didn't develop problems, or they developed this problem, not that problem. We didn't really understand the pathways by which children develop problems. And so we started this longitudinal study to get at those pathways. So along that journey, because it was also a pathway for us, we started to become really uncomfortable with our measure of sexual abuse severity. And by that, I mean the different characteristics that go into defining what severity means, whether it's the identity of the perpetrator, how many times it happened, for how long it went on, the age of the child at the time, that these kinds of things were not very predictive of who is going to go on to have problems. Now, the processes themselves were really important, such as shame and self-blame, and we have other research that goes into that. That's quite predictive of problems later on. But we also wanted to figure out how to get at this severity piece in a way that was more meaningful, because we noticed that there were no good profiles that told us about children who are at risk. So what I mean by that is we noticed that there were some children who had the abuse happen once by a familiar person. And you'd think, oh, that person will be doing better. Then there was someone else, it was a parent perpetrator, it happened many times. They should be doing worse. But we noticed, no, that's not what was going on. That it wasn't really what was happening. We wanted to start to understand really what the abuse meant to the individual, what was it like for them, and how they were processing and making meaning out of the events. So basically, the idea was, well, is it what happened or how the person understands and tells a story about what happens that really is important for understanding how they're going to do over time and who's going to do better and who isn't going to do so well. Okay, so there wasn't much work on this, especially in youth, because the sample I'm going to talk to you about were adolescents. We started with when they were children. At any rate, we knew that this is a hard thing to make meaning about, these events, right? So we know that the abuse violates core assumptions about the self as being lovable, worthy, about others as providing safety and care, and so that would turn the child's world upside down. We also know from work with adults that, at least in one study, 50% of them reported that they still hadn't figured out what these experiences meant for who they were and their relationships with others. If you put that together with the fact that people who do treatment, they feel that being able to make meaning out of these events is really critical for positive adaptation. And if you can't do that, that's going to get in your way of really positive recovery. So wasn't much work here. And actually, most of the work that we could find was with adults. So, and this work tended to be on adults who experience single events, something like a national disaster. Well, that's not an interpersonal event. Or with a stranger. And as you've heard today, sexual abuse usually is not with a stranger, it's with a familiar person. So these different things about sexual abuse, not a one-time incident, often perpetrated by a person that the child knows, and most importantly, something that a child who doesn't have the skills and both cognitive and emotional skills, to be able to process and make sense out of what happened. Some other challenges more specific to child sexual abuse, and one thing I probably should have mentioned is the work I'm talking about today is kind of unique because we chose to focus on only children who had been sexually abused, trying to understand abuse specific processes. We weren't comparing them to children who had other kinds of maltreatment or didn't experience that. We wanted to know specifically about what this experience was like for them. Okay, so we know that processing CSA can be really difficult. You have symptoms which get in the way of encoding the different memories, such as PTSD and dissociation. You have some really quite negative emotions: fear, sadness, shame, and anger, which could make it very difficult to approach the material and try and make sense out of it. We also know, and we've heard earlier, that parents are really an important part of helping children scaffold, and for prevention is also, as well as intervention, to understand negative events. And yet work shows that, well, first of all, there are no common scripts that parents have for how do we talk about the fact that you were sexually abused, and that parents often worry that if I discuss this with a child, it's going to make things worse. And we know from developmental literature that parents are really key to providing that scaffolding to be able to self-regulate and talk about memories and make sense out of them. There's also elements, again, that would make processing difficult that have to do with both self-blame and shame, which are very painful cognitions and emotions, which would make you say, I don't want to try to figure this out, it's too difficult. So processing is really important to understand because we know it's important for recovery. We don't have much work on it, but why, and I could probably be talking to myself here, why, Candice, would you choose to use narratives? Because it's probably the most labor-intensive method that you could think of, where you have to be trained to do the interview, sit down, record it, transcribe it. Why narratives? Well, probably because they are the best way at getting at stories of individuals' lives and how they're trying to explain themselves in terms of life events. And these stories are windows into what we call representations. And representations are really, they're your experiences, your thoughts, your emotions about what's happened to you in the past, and how you put those together to guide your behavior about how you'll be the next time you either interact with someone or you're in a certain situation. They tell us about strategies people use for regulating emotion and attention to memories, and also narratives, which is the best way of getting at representations. They also can tell us about material that are out of awareness. So I could ask an individual, okay, can you check on a scale from 1 to 10 how much you think you figured out what the sexual abuse has meant to you? And they might check a 9. Oh, I figured it out. But then when I ask them to sit down with me and tell me what happened, what was this like for you? How did you feel? How did other people react? That's much more effortful. And there's material that's going to come up during that discussion that the person might not even realize, and which could be very valuable for helping develop interventions. Okay. So not much work and no work out there on children with this history, but there was work out there on attachment and some work on adults that led us to think about what we might expect to see if we were going to look at narratives about child sexual abuse. And I want to actually stop for a second and just clarify that there's a difference. I'm probably using the words processing and meaning making or meanings made interchangeably. And I want to clarify that we're really interested in processing. And processing is the strategies by which a person approaches and thinks and feels and tries to make sense out of what happened to them. Whereas the meaning made is a specific meaning in time, a specific story that you come up with. Now, if you think developmentally, as I would because I'm a developmentalist, we know that these stories need to get updated as your life moves on. So when you start dating, for example, or you become a parent, the story you told yourself about what the abuse meant to you when you were 10 might be very different than the story you're going to tell yourself to make meaning out of the life events when you're 20. So we think that the processing skills are really critical because they give you the ability to change and go back to the story and revise it over time. So what are the different elements that we know were from past literature that are important for both healthy and unhealthy processing? One of them is the regulation of attention to memories, emotions, and reactions. And you can see I have this organized in terms of constructive, so everyone will know that's the healthiest way of processing, and then there are two processing styles that are not particularly healthy. So the regulation of attention for the constructive processor is very balanced. They're willing to approach the material, but they can disengage with it. In contrast to that, the absorbed processor, they attend to the material, but they can't disengage, or they have a lot of difficulty disengaging. The avoidant processor has restricted attention. They don't want to really think about it, and so they really disengage from the material completely. Another element of processing has to do with effortful versus automatic processing. So here the constructive person is effortful in going about the task of trying to figure out what happened, and they take it in manageable doses. The other two styles are more rigid. So the absorbed style is rigidly, if you would, easily overwhelmed. As soon as they start to think of it, they get just caught up in what happened. Whereas the avoidance style is more distant, so their automatic rigid response is just to back away from it. The other element has to do with the approach, if you would, to the meaning-making process. And there, for people who are healthy processors, at least the literature made us think that they would view this as a really important task, and that it's based on a current day perspective, but they're able to sort of look back and see, well, I was like this then, this is how I am now, and they're able to sort of revise their meaning of the events. For the absorbed person, they're also making meaning is important to them, but they have a lot of trouble reflecting on what happened and getting some insight. So they feel very distressed, and they don't feel like they're really getting anywhere in terms of making meaning. The avoidant processor, well, this is an unimportant task, right? Distancing from what happened. They therefore don't want to put much effort into trying to figuring out what happens, and so consequently, their story or their meaning can become quite outdated because they're going to sort of, well, okay, it happened then, I figured it out, and now I don't have to think about it anymore. So armed with that literature that was out there, we developed these three research questions. So do youth with these histories, do they show these different strategies? Because we didn't know that. No one had done the work with this population. Would we expect the healthy and unhealthy strategies to be related to adjustment over time? And hopefully if I talk fast enough, I can get to the third question, which had to do whether can we predict which individuals are going to become healthy versus unhealthy processors? Okay, so the predictions are pretty straightforward. For the first two questions, we expected the constructive strategy to look the best in terms of having the fewest symptomatology and self-blame and shame. The absorbed folks, the ones who get caught up in the events, excuse me, they would show the most problems. And the individuals who are avoidant, well, it was kind of hard to predict them. They were either going to be in the middle, because remember, they're not getting emotionally totally overwhelmed. They have made some sense out of things. On the other hand, they might not report any symptoms because they tend to avoid thinking about this as affecting them. Okay, so let me tell you about the study that we did in order to try and answer some of these questions. We looked at 160 youth who were all confirmed cases of childhood sexual abuse. The sample was pretty representative. We drew them from Child Protective Services, predominantly female, ethnically diverse, poor single-parent families. We saw them at the time of abuse discovery. That was time one, when the abuse came to light of Child Protective Services. We saw them a year later and we saw them 6 years after the first time we saw them. That's what I'm going to focus on right now, because that's when we collected these narratives. Before that, these children at time one had been through, CPS and criminal investigation. We did not want to ask them about what happened. We were more interested in how they were feeling and thinking. But by the time it was 6 years later, we thought, okay, we think we can ask them to tell us about that if they were willing to do that. Okay. The sample itself was pretty severe in terms of at least abuse characteristics. The red is what usually is considered most severe, 30% 10 or more times, perpetrator being a parent figure at about a third of the sample, and 67% of the sample having experienced penetration. Okay. Our adjustment indices were mostly standardized measures, except for the ones we had to develop for our study, which were abuse-specific, shame, and self-blame. Okay, I'm just breezing through that. So here's the interview that we developed. Can you tell me about the abuse with, and then we knew the name of the perpetrator. How did you feel when it was happening? What was it like when other people found out? Have your feelings about what happened changed over time, and how do you think what happened has affected you? So we're not really asking for content of meaning. We wanted to see how they were going to process these events, whether they could look back and see how things might have changed over time, but also understand what it was like for them back then. Okay. We audio taped these interviews. We transcribed them verbatim. Before, we were very fortunate. Trickett, Nolan, Putnam gave us some narratives that they had, so we were able to develop our coding system of the narratives on a sample separate from our own. Then we had, for our own sample, 2 coders who analyzed the transcriptions based on markers we identified that were related to constructive, absorbed, and avoidant processors. And the coders would rate on a 1 to 9 point scale how characteristic the narrative was of being constructive, absorbed, or avoidant. And then they also made a judgment about which processing style seemed most characteristic of that individual. Our approach to this coding system really focused on not themes, but more the structure of the narrative, really focusing on how things are said as much as what was said. Okay. So, constructive strategies. What did they look like? Well, they were a coherent account of events. That means the story had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was easy to follow. There was evidence that it was effortful, that there was some reflection going on. They were able to describe abuse events from a child's perspective, but maintaining an adult's point of view. They were able to admit to vulnerable feelings and thoughts, but without minimizing them or becoming overwhelmed by them. Okay. And there was evidence also of seeing how their perspective had changed over time. Here's a example of a constructive processor, and this is almost prototypic, but this does come from our interviews. At the time and for a while after, I felt dirty, different from other kids. I stopped them hanging around and my friends because I really didn't want to be around anyone. I didn't know how to express what I was feeling, and I held it all inside. But eventually I just couldn't do that anymore, and I had to start dealing with it, because if I didn't, it would just keep getting bigger and bigger. Not all at once, but bit by bit. I'm not sure I'll ever totally understand why it happened. I mean, it's like a sentence for a crime I didn't commit. But I have to, accept it. So I'm figuring out how to deal with it. Not completely, well, not yet, but in some way, so I can be a teenager and continue on with my life. I mean, we've had this theme of hope here. I think this is a very hopeful narrative. Person's able to look back at the time. This is the way I felt. But you see the effortful bit by bit, I started to try and figure it out. I haven't totally figured it out yet, but I'm going to move on. Okay. What about the absorbed processor? Here there's no coherence. There's no clear story of events. Okay, you get a very dysregulated, confusing kind of story. The speaker is overwhelmed by the material they're trying to describe. They get caught up in it. And there is an inability to distance from the past events and to really gain any insight into what happened. So here's a prototypical narrative. It was one of the kinds of things that happened, but it was over with. Nobody was there. I don't remember when it started. Okay, it's very hard to tell what they're trying to say. Okay, what happened? Yes, my cousin. God, Lord. So you can see the person is like almost like a deer stuck in headlights. They're very, very overwhelmed by what they're trying to share. When it's hard because when it first happened, well, not at first, but I told them it was just that. But after that, I never talked about it anymore. I don't know what to say. Where do you even begin? It's just too much. I don't know. And when I tell somebody I am mad, that the one person I mean, I was extremely mad, I still am to this day. I mean, the one person that's supposed to be there for me 24/7 for the rest of my life, to whenever, she lives. She doesn't believe me, my mother, and this is my mom, and she doesn't believe me, and I am 8 years old. Oh, well, that's good. We need a little comic relief after reading that. So you can see, I mean, very intense. The person is being caught up. They're having a really hard time relating. They're trying to convey what happened. And you can see this person shifts into the present tense. So it's almost like they're reliving. Okay, markers of the avoidant processor. Shall I stop for a second and let you disconnect that? I would not like to make. All right, no problem. So, descriptions of the avoidant processor are brief. They're fact-driven. They're also rigid, but they're very emotionally distant. And the person really makes very little effort to try and get insight into what happened to them. So the absorbed person is really trying to get some insight, but they're just incapable because they're being overwhelmed by their emotions. This person really devalues this task. I'm not going to make an effort. So they often, their explanations or their stories are outdated or seem contradicted. This is going to be a short one, right? Distancing. Okay, well, I had a molestation. Passive tense. It's not I was molested. I had a molestation. And it, not I or I and my family, entered court and they took care of it. All that typical big mess that you see on TV. Also a way, so, it happens on TV. It didn't happen to me. I was like a kid at the time. Of course it was his fault. So, it didn't really bother me. So if we had more time, I would ask you, say, well, so where are the contradictions, right? It didn't bother me, but it was like the big mess on TV. Of course it was his fault. Now, we want people to get to the point where they understand it wasn't their fault, but this is just too much of a knee-jerk kind of reaction. Not a lot of insight here. Okay, so we had these narratives. We identified these markers. We actually had 108 of them. We had agreement between two coders on 94% of them. And I will just say that people really did seem to have processing styles that were characteristic of them. People often ask me, well, couldn't people do several different ones? And in most cases, no. They tended to rely on one kind of strategy. Okay. So, here's the shocker. We did not expect these findings. They were extremely distressing to us. So yes, we identified these kind of processing strategies in youth that we expected. Here's the distribution. Only 14% of our sample, 6 years after abuse discovery, showed us this constructive kind of processing. Now, if that isn't a huge call to prevention, I don't know what is. So a large proportion, 49%, were absorbed, 37% were avoidant. No relation to abuse characteristics, did not affect, was not related to what kind of processing style you developed or demographic characteristic. There was some relationship with age. Older youth were more likely to be constructive, but again, the sample size for them is so tiny, I don't know what to make out of that. Gender differences, boys tended to be more avoidant than girls. Again, we didn't have as many boys as we would like, but at least it's suggestive. What about the breakdown of problems by recovery style? So you have to forgive me, I like numbers, so there are numbers up here. But the takeaway message, if you look in the red, that will show you that the hypothesis that the constructive would do the best, and then the avoidant, and then the absorbed, who would be the worst, that panned out for intrusive experiences, for defensive avoidance, and for dissociation. For anxious arousal and depression, the constructive processors and avoidant processors looked more similar, but they were different from the absorbed. That was true for at least sexual concerns, in terms of the absorbed looking the worst, and for shame, for the abuse, again, it was the absorbed folks that looked the most shame. Okay, so we feel that abuse narratives are a great window into processing styles individuals employ to try to make meaning out of these events that happen to them. These three styles that we identified are consistent with previous literature that emphasize the importance of effortful processing and flexible attention to the events. And, of course, the constructive processing was, the most adaptive. And, so then the question becomes, how do we try to have more constructive processors? And that brings me to the clinical implications. So the bad news is that the passage of time is not enough for people to develop these constructive processing, which we know are important for coming up with meaning making that's going to really provide the foundation for better recovery and adaptation. The good news is that we have some strategies out there that can help us understand the kinds of techniques we can use to help youth develop these processing skills. So I think Esther Dellinger left, but the development of a storybook where you're talking about what happened, you're helping youth regulate their emotions, to deal with the negative but back off when they have to, and all these kinds of skills really set the stage for reappraising their emotions and their cognition so that they can have those healthy processing skills, so over time, as they develop, they have ways of updating the meanings that they're going to make. All right. Where am I? Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about trying to predict who are going to develop these processing styles. So we did not collect these narratives at time 1 and time 2, and I told you why. But we did have other measures that we took, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how stigmatization or abuse-specific shame and self-blame, as well as PTSD, could we use those at earlier time points to predict these processing styles later? All right, so this is kind of a little graphic of, here are these two earlier things. So you have abuse, stigmatization, and PTSD, and you have those at time 1 and time 2, and can that help explain who's going to develop these different styles? Now, we were particularly interested in change from time 1 to time 2. We thought that, people who were getting better, they might be more likely to develop these healthy processing styles in terms of their symptomatology going down and stigmatization getting less, going down also, because we know that time of discovery is extremely stressful for the families, for the children, and sometimes you're likely to see a lot of shame, a lot of self-blame, symptomatology, and then once the stress of that is over and some intervention happens, that goes down. But for youth where it persists, where they persist with these symptoms and problems, they're probably going to be most at risk for developing the unhealthy strategies. So let me tell you quickly about what we found. And I think you can just focus. Okay, so this is for using stigmatization, so shame and self-blame at time 1, and how they predicted, at the top you see, absorb versus constructive strategies. And what this is telling you, can I go away from the podium, is that for those youth who did not change as much in terms of shame and self-blame, right, they were more likely to be absorbed than constructive in how they process the abuse. That was also true for avoidant versus constructive. So those who did not show as much recovery in terms of these negative shame and self-blame kinds of feelings about the self, they were more likely to be avoidant than constructive. We weren't really able to differentiate absorbed versus avoidance. So we know, therefore, that early symptomatology, PTSD, and the shame self-blame can tell us who's going to have an unhealthy processing strategy, but not which one they're going to pick. Okay. What about PTSD? Well, there, interestingly enough, individuals who are high in PTSD at time 1, they were more likely to be absorbed in their processing style. They were also likely to show less change from time 1 to time 2 in PTSD. For the avoidant versus constructive, that was in the right direction, but it wasn't significant. And again, we weren't able to differentiate between absorbed and avoidance. So it's, it's suggestive that there are things we could be doing earlier on to try and develop strategies to encourage youth to develop these positive processing strategy. Let me just go to, it says, this underscores the importance of early intervention and prevention. I'm going to change my slides. And we need to decrease negative reactions, whether it's shame, self-blame, PTSD, because that tends to drive these negative processing, but also, I think, helping youth construct healthy understandings of what happened to them, giving them the skills, not, it's the perpetrator's fault. That's an important thing, but how to help them scaffold the processing of how you get to that meaning is I think, really, really critical. One way of doing this is by facilitating supportive reactions from others, and whether this is parents, friends, or treatment providers, this is critical. So I thank you for your attention, and just acknowledge my collaborators.